Today I'm going to present some of my work on root functional traits and the root economic spectrum. And in this presentation I hope to explain why and how I think we should move from correlating leaf and root functional traits to integrating them at the whole plant level in order to understand how leaf and root traits together influence larger scale complexer processes such as tree growth. So this work was carried out during my PhD at Wageningen University, in which I happily collaborated with a great team of supervisors and advisors. So the root economic spectrum originates from the leaf economic spectrum, and at this stage I think we're all pretty familiar with this concept, but I briefly want to recap that at one side of the spectrum we find plant species with acquisitive leaf functional traits that allow high photosynthetic rates and fast plant growth when resource availability is high. And at the other end of the spectrum we find plant species with conservative leaf traits that allow these plants to conserve their valuable resources over a long time, and that enable these species to survive in resource-poor environments. Right, so these plant species with acquisitive leaves do need a fast supply of water and nutrients in order to maintain their high photosynthetic rates and their fast plant growth. And therefore it is expected that they have acquisitive roots as well. So these acquisitive roots would be long and thin, so they have a large uptake area, they would have high nitrogen content and fast uptake rates. Conversely, conservative species need not only retain their above ground biomass, but also their below ground biomass in order to retain their resources. So therefore these species are expected to have long-lived and thick roots in order to conserve these resources. So based on this leaf economic spectrum above ground and on these expected interactions above and below ground, it is expected that a root economic spectrum also exists. And this root economic spectrum would thus range from an acquisitive root trait syndrome to a conservative root trait syndrome, and it is expected that this root economic spectrum operates in parallel to a leaf economic spectrum, so that species with conservative roots also have conservative leaves, and that these trait spectra are represented by parallel functional traits. So in previous work, Liesje Mommen and I already noticed that there is very little evidence for this root economic spectrum in the literature, and we further looked into this in the current study, where we addressed the questions whether root traits are correlated to each other in these acquisitive or conservative trait syndromes, and whether they are correlated to seemingly parallel leaf functional traits. And we addressed this question in a literature review that included 18 different studies on the fine root functional traits of more than 2 tree species. And we started with looking at the results that were reported by individual studies on the root economic spectrum. And the next step was to compile a larger data set with all the data from these different studies and carry out a meta-level analysis in order to test the expected root trait correlations. So before I'm going to show you some of our results, I briefly want to point out, for those that are not so familiar with the root economic spectrum or root functional traits, that at each of the following slides you find our hypothesis on the top right. So you find this acquisitive root trait syndrome and all the functional traits that are associated with this strategy, and a conservative root trait syndrome as well. The root traits that I'm addressing in the specific slides are marked in red, and obviously root traits that belong to the same trait syndrome are expected to be positively correlated, and those that belong to opposite trait syndromes are expected to be negatively correlated. So we started looking at the relationship between fine root lifespan and specific root length, and we expected this correlation to be negative. But unfortunately, we only found 2 studies in our literature review that explicitly tested this correlation, and one of them found the expected negative correlation across 3 species, and the other one found no significant relationship. And then we carried out a meta-level analysis, and you see the results in this graph. So on the x-axis, specific root length, on the y-axis, root lifespan. Each data point refers to a specific species, and the different colors refer to different studies. So in total, we found 30 different data points from 4 different studies, and these were significantly negatively correlated, which agrees with the hypothesis. So from this, well, still fairly limited data set, we can conclude that thick roots might actually live longer. We also looked at the relationship between fine root lifespan and fine root nitrogen content, but we only found 1 study that tested this hypothesis, and it found no significant relationship. And we have heard other talks over the past couple of days that addressed or showed different similar root trait correlations. So to give a more complete picture, I have shortly included these in the slides as well. So this particular study found no significant relationship, and in the talk by Luke McCormack, they found a negative correlation. We found more studies that correlated root C to N ratios to fine root lifespan, and 2 out of the 2 studies that tested this did find a positive correlation, which agrees with the root economic spectrum hypothesis. But our meta-level analysis across 32 data points found no significant relationship there. So from this, again, there are very few results on the relationship between root chemical traits and fine root lifespan, and these results seem to be mixed. Also, we looked at studies that correlated fine root physiology and lifespan, but we found no studies that tested the correlation between fine root uptake rates and fine root lifespan across 3 species. And we found 1 study that correlated fine root respiration and lifespan, and it found no significant relationship. So the only conclusion we can draw here is that there are virtually no data on fine root physiology versus fine root lifespan. And I think this has been pointed out in several previous other talks as well and on posters. Luckily, we had more data on other root traits, and we tested the relationship on fine root nitrogen content and specific root length. We had almost 180 data points, but we found no significant correlation here. We also correlated fine root nitrogen content and tissue density, and here we did find a negative correlation that was in line with the root economic spectrum hypothesis. So basically, species that have dense root tissue have a lower root nitrogen content. So we have more data, but still we did not find clear, consistent relationships between root morphology and root chemical traits. So from these results, we concluded that there's basically no evidence of a root economic spectrum in which root traits are correlated to each other in the expected trait syndromes. And then we looked at studies that correlated seemingly parallel root and leaf traits, and we found scattered results as well. For instance, we found studies that reported a positive or a negative correlation between specific leaf area and specific root length and leaf and root nitrogen content. We found 1 study that tested the correlation between fine root and leaf lifespan, and it found no significant relationship. And again, the relationship between fine root and leaf uptake has never been tested across 3 species. So from that, we conclude that a fine root economic spectrum does not seem to exist in parallel to a leaf economic spectrum across 3 species. And we've come up with 3 possible explanations for this conclusion. The first one, and I think it's already been mentioned briefly in Etienne's talk, is that the links between functional traits and actual functioning or uptake in this case are very different above and below ground. And nitrogen content is a very clear example. So leaf nitrogen content has been found in general to be a good proxy of photosynthetic capacities, simply because a large part of the leaf nitrogen is stored in rubisco, which directly controls photosynthetic capacity. For root nitrogen content, in contrast, this relationship between root nitrogen and uptake capacity is far less established. It seems, however, that the fraction of root nitrogen that is stored in enzymes that are involved in resource uptake is far less than the photosynthetic nitrogen in leaves. So this implies that the relationships between traits, functional traits, and actual functioning cannot be extrapolated from the above ground to the below ground, so that the traits that we so commonly measure might actually not really tell us something about fine root functioning. Secondly, fine roots and leaves act in very different environments. So leaf traits are mainly optimized in order to acquire light, but roots have to acquire water and about 15 different mineral elements simultaneously from the soil. And these different resources might all differ in their availability and in their mobility, and therefore they might actually require different traits. For instance, as shown in the previous presentation, if immobile nutrients are the limiting resource, plants might actually benefit more from more prolific root branching than an increase in specific root length. In the case of mobile nutrient limitations, plants may benefit more from increasing a specific root length. So this implies that we need to know what limiting resources there are, or a limiting resource or co-limiting resources, in order to understand why plant species express their root functional traits in different ways. And these different ways may not only be reflected by changes in specific root length, but for instance also in root branching, which is very little measured. And besides having to acquire all these different resources, plants also have to deal with other soil variables, such as soil structure and soil chemical properties, which may strongly constrain fine root traits. For instance, an increase in specific root length may be very efficient to acquire resources, but plant species may not always be able to produce long and thin roots in soils that are very dense, because in dense soils such long and thin roots may not be able to penetrate such dense soils. And this seems to indicate that fine root functional traits do not necessarily indicate an acquisitive or a conservative strategy, but they might be very strongly constrained by soil variables that are not related to resource availability. And a third strategy has already been mentioned here several times and be referred to as the elephant in the room, and that are mycorrhizal fungi. So in order to deal with the complex and diverse soil matrix, plants seem to have developed different below ground uptake strategies, and an important one of those is mycorrhizal fungi. And in fact, recent studies and also the FRED database presented by Luke on Tuesday have shown that thick roots that are considered to be conservative might actually be very acquisitive, because they might host more mycorrhizal fungi. So this means that when we just look at the root traits, we cannot tell whether a species is conservative or acquisitive in its uptake below ground. So to conclude this first part of my talk, there doesn't seem to be a root economic spectrum in parallel to a leaf economic spectrum, but instead root traits might have to be positioned in a multidimensional space that looks, for instance, like this. However, I started my presentation with plants needing to maintain a functional balance between their above and below ground uptake rates. So for instance, these species with acquisitive leaves still need a fast nutrient and water supply to maintain their photosynthetic capacities. So in order to supply resources below ground fastly, trees can increase their specific root length, but there's a second strategy available to plants, and that's an increase in fine root mass. Both increasing specific root length and fine root mass lead to a larger below ground uptake area and therefore to more uptake. And we've been looking at these two traits and how they together might influence above ground functioning and ultimately tree growth. So this is where I argued that we might want to integrate rather than correlate leaf functional traits. And I'm going to show you how we've done that. So we used a tree growth model that has been developed a couple of years ago and has been published by Frank Sterk. And the previous version of this model consisted of an above ground component only. So in this model, whole tree growth is defined as the net carbon gain, which is expressed here as the carbon that's kilograms of carbon that's been gained per day. So plants can gain carbon through photosynthesis in the leaves, but they can lose carbon through tissue turnover and respiration. In this model, leaf area index plays a very important role. But before I get into that, I briefly want to explain what these three boxes mean. So these are the three main carbon processes in our model. And they're basically the product of a certain mass and a certain carbon gain or carbon loss rate. And they too are expressed as the kilograms of carbon that are gained or lost over the day. So leaf area index, the influence of leaf area index on photosynthesis. The box of photosynthesis is basically the product of a certain leaf mass and the leaf photosynthetic rate. Similarly, the box turnover, so carbon that's lost by tissue turnover, is the product of a leaf mass and the turnover rate. And the carbon lost through respiration at the whole plant level is the product of a leaf mass and a certain leaf respiration rate. So an increase in leaf area index leads to more carbon gain, but in order to maintain a high leaf area index and photosynthesis, plants need water and nutrients, and that's what we've developed, that we've incorporated into our model during my PhD research. Water and nutrients are obviously acquired by the roots, and as I've previously explained, we've been focusing on two root traits that are associated with the below ground uptake area, and these are root mass and specific root length. So an increase in either one of these root traits leads to an increase in below ground resource uptake, which allows a larger leaf area index and more photosynthetic carbon gain, so more tree growth. However, there are carbon losses involved as well. So a fine root mass, similar to leaf mass, a large fine root mass times a certain fine root turnover rate leads to more carbon losses through turnover at the whole plant level. And similarly, if you have a large fine root mass times a given fine root respiration rates, you lose more carbon at the whole plant level through respiration. An increase in specific root length, however, does not incur extra carbon cost in this model, because an increase in specific root length basically means that you can increase your below ground uptake area at a certain biomass investment. So with the model, we tested the root trait effects on tree growth through these below and above ground interactions. And this is our first result, and let me briefly walk you through the graph. On the x-axis, you see a range of specific root length values that we've modeled, and on the y-axis, a range of fine root mass values. For each of the combinations of these different root traits, the model simulates the net carbon gain as the photosynthesis minus the turnover minus the respiration, and it's still expressed in kilograms of carbon per day. And the Scholar scale here at the right indicates the amount of carbon gained or lost at the whole plant level. So in this figure, you also see a thick line, which is the zero isocline. And at this line, the net carbon balance of a plant is zero, so the carbon gained is equal to the carbon lost. So we can see different things here. In the first place, we see that at a low fine root mass, so over here at 0.2 kilograms per cubic meter, an increase in specific root length leads to an increase in tree growth. And actually, the highest tree growth values that came out of the model. So specific root length seem to have quite strong contribution to tree growth, especially if plants do not have a lot of fine root mass. What we also see is that at a high fine root mass, so approximately above this red line, the net carbon balance is almost always negative, which means that the carbon losses exceed the carbon gained. So basically, if you have a large fine root mass, so more than, say, 0.55, trees will die because they have a negative carbon balance. However, this first scenario that I've just explained is not very realistic because, as I've shown in our literature review, there are carbon costs involved in having a high specific root length, and that's because roots with long and thin roots basically have a shorter lifespan, as you can see in this figure. Species with a high specific root length generally have a shorter root lifespan, so it increases the turnover rates of roots. And we've incorporated this specific relationship into a model so that an increase in specific root length leads to an increase in the turnover rates and therefore to an increase in the carbon lost through tissue turnover at the whole plant level. And again, we tested how fine root mass and specific root length influence tree growth. So we see a rather similar figure. Similar to the first scenario, we see that an increase in specific root length still leads to the fastest growth if you have a low fine root mass. But in contrast to the first scenario, we see that a new trait niche seems to appear, which is over here. So on this side of the graph, so under these root trait combinations, we still see that there's a negative carbon balance. But over here, the carbon balance is actually positive, and it was not in the first scenario. So this seems to indicate that different trait combinations or strategies, if you will, might lead to similar growth rates. So plants can either have few roots but with a high specific root length and have a large uptake area, but they can also have more roots that are thicker in order to reduce their turnover costs due to faster fine root turnover rates. And our empirical data seem to point in the same direction. So in an earlier study, I've measured tree growth on 10 different tree species in a common garden forest soil experiment, and I found that 9 out of 10 species grew equally fast. Later, I went back to the forest and sampled the fine roots of these 10 different species, and I plotted them in this performance landscape. So each symbol here represents a different species. And you can see that here is a group of 4 species that had a higher specific root length but a lower fine root mass. And here's a group of 6 other species that had lower specific root length and a higher fine root mass. So both results show how our modeling exercise might actually demonstrate the influences of multiple strategies, below ground strategies on tree growth. So to conclude, there doesn't seem to be a root economic spectrum parallel to a leaf economic spectrum, but a multidimensional space instead, which has been so nicely illustrated in this figure here. I realized, however, that this still sounds a bit vague, so I want to better explain what this means by looking at a more specific example. So specific leaf area has a central position or very important role in the leaf economic spectrum, and I wanted to see what the role would be of specific root length in this multidimensional environment. So first of all, we did find a negative correlation between fine root lifespan and specific root length, which might indicate that producing thicker roots of lower specific root length might actually be a conservative strategy. So you prevent resource loss through root shedding. However, the other side of the story is that a high specific root length has not been clearly related to an increase in uptake rates, especially not across tree species in the field. And this is probably not only due to a lack of data and because due to the difficulties of measuring these traits, but as I've indicated before, it might also result from the complexity of the soil environment. So for instance, if phosphorus, a more immobile nutrient, is less available, plants might not increase their specific root length, but instead they might increase their branching intensity. And this might explain why specific root length suddenly is not so important anymore, but root branching is. So this shows that we should look at those soil resources and which ones are limiting. And then there's also the other soil variables that are shown over here. Plant species may not be able to increase their specific root length in very dense soils. Instead, if they cannot make these long and thin roots, they might increase their below ground uptake area by increasing their fine root mass, as I have sort of demonstrated or shown using our whole tree growth model. And there you can already see that multiple strategies are showing up. So we have, besides specific root length, we have branching intensity, we have fine root mass, and we have the mycorrhizal fungi over there. Besides that, there's also, species can also vary their length of their root hairs, the density of their root hairs. They can produce these beautiful cluster roots or increase nutrient uptake through exudation. But I hope to have demonstrated that all these, well, at least for fine root mass, I have hoped to have demonstrated how these different strategies might still lead to increased resource uptake and might all be relevant strategies in order to match the above and the below ground demand for resources. And I hope that my model shows at least one way, and it's still a working process, to test these impacts of these different strategies at the whole tree level by integrating traits rather than just correlating traits that seem to be parallel. So what this figure shows is, in the first place, it shows why we have hired a professional graphic designer to make a conceptual model rather than doing it myself. It also might be a discouraging prospect for simplifying traits, simplifying plant performance based on functional traits, because this stuff's kind of messy. But it's also very encouraging and stimulating outlook on new hypotheses we can test in future research. We can maybe look at fine roots from a more multidimensional perspective to find out which root traits are indeed relevant for fine root functioning and therefore for tree growth, and maybe even larger scale processes such as vegetation dynamics or ecosystem functioning. But I do want to make the point here that I think we should try to unravel this a bit more before we get into that. Finally, I want to thank everyone that has been helping me during my PhD research. So not only my great team of supervisors and other advisors, but also field assistants, students and interns, and particularly Leo Goudswaard at Wageningen University, who has helped me collect and wash out and scan all these horrible tree roots. But that has led to such a great results. And I've defended my thesis last February, and this is it. I brought a couple of hard copies, so if you're interested, I can share some. And I'm also willing to send you a PDF version of the thesis. So this includes both the literature review as well as the modeling study that has not been published yet, but I'm working on it. Thank you.